Title, Psychology and Religion, Is There a Ghost in the Machine? Where the title comes from, Gilbert Ryle was thinking about the idea that's been dominant in Western philosophy and thinking since Descartes, if not earlier, the idea that there's been a material world and animal bodies fit into this world and machines, whereas humans also have another aspect, the mental world. So there's these two kinds of world, and Ryle was mocking this idea with his phrase, 1949 I think it was, you know, there is no ghost in the machine. There's no mind or spirit in the machine. So the question is there a mind, soul or spirit or whatever? It's good to pass the rec centre across the road here, recreation centre. And what does it say? Serving body, mind and soul. So are we three in one like that, or are we just one? Just body. And the second aspect of this question is, do we have free will or are we machines? Now these two aspects of the question, they're intertwined, and I'm focusing more on the second one, but they're intertwined issues. And I'm going to touch on two levels to this discussion. Firstly, very broad brush, science, history, theory and neuroscience. I know not a lot about neuroscience, but I think I should just, you know, bring you up to date a bit with a couple of things happening, and my own area of social perception. So that's where I'm going, if I have time. And very briefly, does it matter if we have free will or not? You know, and if people are machines or not? You know, if people are not responsible for their actions. Well, of course, this issue is very central to law and morality and most religions, that people are responsible for their actions, that there are such things as good and evil. There are differences in different religions. So it's a very central issue. And Skinner, a behaviourist at Harvard University, very prominent mind in the 20th century in psychology, wrote this book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971, arguing that you know, humans are part of the animal kingdom, the material world, and our behaviour is driven by the same principles. In our minds, such as it is, we don't need to use mental concepts, Skinner said, operates in the same way as animals, and we should drop this worldview of responsibility, free will, and so on, and replace it with a different perspective based on the discovery or realization, if you like, that we're just another animal. On the other hand, Wegener, also at Harvard, a current scholar, Skinner's dead now, he argues against free will, and I'll touch on his argument, which is in my area. But he says this actually doesn't make any difference for the real world. He says we don't have free will, but we go on living as if we do. But I think Wegener's wrong, and I'm just going to touch on this very, very briefly here. As Kaplan pointed out in 2006, you know, if it's proven in various ways that human behaviour is driven by a brain condition or a mental illness, then defence lawyers, perhaps especially in the United States, but also in New Zealand or elsewhere, will use this as a justification for a person not being held responsible for their actions on grounds of diminished responsibility. So I'm arguing it is an important issue. Just a brief broad brush approach over some science and history and theories of knowledge. Comte, a Frenchman in the 19th century, argued that knowledge, perhaps like evolution, has a certain logical progression, that in primitive cultures or early cultures, people use religious or animist explanations, seeing purposes or personality in nature. We move from these religious type explanations to scientific explanations of the same events. And so, for example, whereas once Kant said, whereas once we might have explained thunder as the act of angry gods, we now explain it as a natural event, electricity and so on. Floods were the punishment of the gods, perhaps volcanoes, earthquakes, droughts, disease, and prosperity was a sign of God's blessing. Some people still hold these views. Now, I'm saying these are theories of knowledge, and Kant's idea, it's fascinating to me, but there's a lot of problems with it. It's wrong in some ways, but it's a challenge to us that we must face up to and think about, whatever we think of it. And Kant secondly said that this progression, it moves from astronomy, Galileo in the 16th century, a very distant, looking at distant bodies, it's gradually moved closer and closer to ourselves, this use of naturalistic scientific explanations in place of religious or animist explanations. So that's one theory that's a challenge to us in the background. It's a theory of history. And then perhaps this facetious title, there are what I've called doctrines of scientific fundamentalists. And fortunately I can describe these very briefly because they've been very well covered in previous papers. Reductionism, the doctrine that the whole is nothing other than the sum of the parts, all boils down to physics, covered in Stephen's paper. Materialism, there's only one reality, matter, there is no soul or spirit. Determinism, that there's only one type of cause for events, mechanistic causes, there is no purpose in our actions, there's no gods wanting things, well expressed in that quote of Dawkins earlier. Behaviorism in psychology is an example of that. Now, I'm not going to describe these because they've been well described already. But all these doctrines, they're all contested, and Stephen discussed this to some extent. And Nobel Prize winners like Sperry, who chopped the brain in half and won a Nobel Prize for his examination of it to deal with epilepsy, he argues very strongly against a reductionist account of the mind. For example, continuity of the species it's not a doctrine in the same kind of way, but here, and we've discussed this a lot, but the humans evolved from animals, so the idea here is that we can therefore fully explain human behaviour by the same principles. And I'm not endorsing intelligent design here for a moment. I think that's unfeasible as an approach. But Polkinghorne has said, well, and he accepts evolution. He's at Cambridge, was a physicist, also now a theologian, vicar. He said that there are some aspects of human psychology, human nature, that don't seem to have served. They go way beyond what evolution would have required in terms of adaptiveness. For example, creativity. It's hard to see how, what Rembrandt can do was required for evolutionary purposes, how it was adaptive, or mathematics is another. People often, especially in Wellington, love this idea. We have 98.4% of the same genes as apes and so on. So in liberal Wellington, people love this kind of fact. And you think about that, and we do, and Graham says this is correct, but here's a keyboard here, and if you put an ape at the keyboard, or a person with severe brain injury who's angry, they'd probably throw the keyboard out the door or smash it to pieces. If you put John Wells at the keyboard, who's here, and has 98.4% of the same genes as these apes, you will get the difference. And someone said, there is a difference between the extinct mollusk and bark. And if John would play at the end, we would see the difference, no trouble. He could play us an anthem or hymn or something, as Gould used to do at the end of his talks when he was alive. Neuroscience, not my area, but neuroscience is tightening the links between brain and mind. So, for example, neurotransmitters, chemical processes in the brain, you can map these quite closely onto moods such as depression, and you can give people drugs that will lessen their depression. Just one example. So increasingly we can map different states, whether it's aggression or happiness or sadness, meditation, onto brain processes. Brain conditions, dementia, and brain injury. In 20 years, many of us will have dementia and will be a bit different from how we are now. And this is a challenge. People can change considerably with dementia, as my mother did, with Parkinson's. Brain injury, people can change fundamentally, and I was just talking about this with Bob, and a personal anecdote, and he said, oh, I should tell this, so I will, but it'll take a lot of my time. Or 5 minutes. But anyway, our son Joe, when we were on sabbatical in Cambridge and enjoying the intellectual world and C.S. Lewis's 50th anniversary of his death or birth or something, and chapel at Magdalen and these wonderful events and great talks. We cycling home from church on a Sunday, and our son got hit by a car that the police later estimated was travelling at 52 miles an hour, judging by how far the helmet was spread. He had severe brain injury. And Professor Pickard, who Bob probably knows, Professor of Neurosurgery, spent his Sunday night inside our son's brain. 4 o'clock Monday morning, he said his surgery had been largely unsuccessful and our son would die or be a very different person to what he'd been. So people prayed for us at Holy Trinity Church, our church. The vicar came in, David Hancock, remembered his name since I spoke to you. Chris Hancock, that's it. Vicar, didn't even know who you were. Said, look, our son's in hospital. We're one of your home groups. He's very ill. We'd like to contact New Zealand. So he came straight into hospital, didn't know where to find us, found us. British Telecom helped. He picked up the phone. British Telecom, I'm a vicar. I want to ring this number in New Zealand. Got through to my sister who's sitting here. Told her about Joe's condition. He's likely to die. And so the people in Wellington prayed for him, Holy Trinity did. What's nice about this story, all the people at Churchill College where I was staying, the fellows, the master, were supportive. And what was nice too was that in our little cottage of families, not a cottage, but group of families, the Jewish people there prayed for us, the Buddhist families prayed for us. The colleague who I'd went to England to work with, who's an atheist, said, I'll pray for Joe. So it's been an up and down story since then. The next day, the anaesthetist, an Egyptian, presumably a Muslim, Menon, who's also famous in that area, said the brain swelling has stopped. This seems to be miraculous. But it's been up and down since there. A few months later, or a month later, psychometric tests, they said he was on the first percentile, that's the bottom 1%, previously a very able child. First sentence, when they said he's not speaking, and so the people in the next bed would try and teach him sign language, and we didn't want him to learn sign language because their daughter couldn't speak either. We wanted him to speak, so they said, take him home, he might talk. So we took him home, although he had lots of wires and so on attached to him, and it was still strange. And then he spoke. He came up to his mother and he said, Mum, I want to smash your face in. So I thought, felt very ambivalent. He speaks, but who is it that's speaking? What is this son of ours? So, he's since got his bachelor's degree in Latin. So he did much better than that first percentile. A lot of people have supported this, but this illustrates to us a personal story that brain injury can change people fundamentally. So in many ways, we think of ourselves as not part of the brain morally, but the frontal part of our brain is very much a part of our moral being. So, hope you forgive me for that one anecdote. Brain stimulation. If you stimulate part of the brains to make people do an action, you can stimulate a brain and a person will carry out an action. Again, what's interesting here is that people often will invent a reason why they did that. So you stimulate the brain and they pick up their watch. And you say, why do you do that? And they say, oh, I needed to know the time. But but they didn't do it, you made them do it. So that's called confabulation. You get the same with split brain experiments. You get the right brain to do something and the left brain gives a totally invented reason for why it happened. Fascinating. Brain activity, you could spend a lecture on this next point. Brain activity precedes awareness of the will. So if you are told to raise your finger, brain activity that you're not aware of will actually precede your conscious awareness of the action. And some people say that's a challenge to consciousness, to free will. But this is very much debated. A brilliant chapter by Dick Passingham at Oxford on this I can tell anyone about if you're interested. Also, this research in neuroscience doesn't seem to find evidence for a soul or spirit in the sense that there's separate entities in the brain, and I'll come back to that in the end. Or separate entities in the person, be a better way of putting it. But I'll return to that if I have time. There's another side to this coin though, which is kind of interesting. The mental world, our minds, can affect brain events. For example, the Dalai Lama is working with neuroscientists in America at the moment. A lot of neuroscientists are opposed to this bridging of science and religion, but which is interesting, but others are doing it. Showing that experienced Buddhist monks, when they meditate, it changes their brain activity, similar to the way that Indian, I don't know what you call them, but people can change their heart rate significantly. Buddhist monks in the parietal lobes, it changes their brain activity, depresses brain activity. So to some extent there is mind over matter. Placebo effects are so fascinatingly close to faith. Some people are totally comfortable with placebo effects, but they're really scared of the concept of faith. But placebo effect is where, say, you give a person a pill, just got sugar in it, but if you say, this pill has actually been shown to cure depression, or for ethical reasons you may not say that, and this person has depression, but they will feel much better after taking that pill if they believe your authority. And you can even get the same with physical surgery. I don't have time for an example there right now. And again, these show mind over matter to some extent, that people's beliefs have a huge influence on events, physical events, like the experience of pain and so on. Also, although you can map a lot of our thoughts and emotions onto brain functions, increasingly the hard problem of just what consciousness is doesn't go away at all. We're still conscious beings overall. We have this global thing called consciousness. So when the brain surgeon looks at your brain, he or she is looking at it from the outside, whereas you're looking at it from the inside. And that's a reality. And some people, as a model for dealing with this, have suggested instead of the idea with Descartes that there's two kinds of stuff, brain or matter and mind as a kind of stuff, that there's really only one reality overall, but we have two perspectives on it. It's called dual perspective monism at the moment. Warren at Fuller School of Theology, or whatever it is, at California, and Newberg, Polkinghorne also suggests this view, where there's one reality, but two perspectives on it. Just briefly, humanistic psychology has reacted to a lot of the deterministic approaches to psychology and science in general. And they've said this mechanistic science is wrong. And a lot of these are wishful thinkers, others are very good scholars, including some in physics and elsewhere. Not that physics is better or whatever, but it's always interesting what they have to say. And so they say, well, humans are just fundamentally different from other animals. We have free choice, we have responsibility, we have a self. We also understand why we do things. Rom Harry, philosopher at Oxford, said, if you want to know why people do things, don't observe their behaviour or their brain, ask them why they did things. And Carl Rogers applied this approach to therapy, and saying we shouldn't understand people like Freud did in terms of Oedipus complexes or whatever, or Skinner in terms of reflexes, but people really understand themselves if you provide benign, supportive counselling conditions. And this is very seductive to many people, excuse me, with religious worldviews, including many Christians. Because they think, that nasty man Freud, he was wrong, and so was Skinner, another nasty man, but this stuff says, we're different from animals, and we're good, and we understand ourselves. However, we don't fully understand ourselves. Our accounts are often full of self-justifications. Or as someone put it, our heart is desperately wicked above all things. So I love that kind of phrase. So full of truth or perceptiveness. Okay, moving more into my own area. Hope I'm okay for time, but the area of social perception, and there have been really two steps to this, or two stages. Firstly, Nisbet and Wilson, the most cited article in psychology in the 1970s, in the Psychological Review. The argument was about how much we really understand our own actions and what are the causes of our actions. And they cited hundreds of experiments showing we make a lot of mistakes in explaining our actions. For example, where a stimulus has affected us. I'm just going to summarise this argument, apologise for that. Sorry. Secondly, we make the same errors as an informed observer. An informed observer can be as accurate as we are about our own actions. So what follows from that is if the reports of subjects don't differ from the reports of observers, then it's not necessary to assume that the former are drawing on a fount of privileged knowledge. So they're challenging the idea that through introspection we understand our own behaviour, that there's something in our mind that tells us why we do things. And taking this further, in the present, people like John Barge at New York, priming, for example, they show in experiments, if you take a whole lot of New York students and get them to read a manuscript, and there are a few words like Florida or whatever that just refer to ageing, because Florida is a warm state where a lot of older people go. In America, but like Tauranga or New Zealand perhaps, where we don't have such ranges of temperature, Nelson. They just read this manuscript and then they're told to go on to the next experiment. And when they walk down the hall, they've shown with lots of measures, micro measures, these people walk more slowly down the hall than people who've read other documents that don't have, Florida in it, and these kind of little prompts with aging. And they say this. But you ask these people, did you think about aging? Did you think about this? And they say, no, not at all. They'll totally deny these stimuli have any effect on them whatsoever. Now, there's two problems in this argument. I've had a go at it, and also Erickson and Simon. Simon's a Nobel Prize winner, which is a huge achievement in psychology, because there's no Nobel Prize in psychology. You have to win the Nobel Prize in economics, so you have to be a really good psychologist to do that. There's two of them. This is one. To influence your own field plus economics. And they pointed out in my own, it's my book, this research that Nisbet and Wilson and Barge and so on perform and describe, it focuses a lot on certain cognitions, attitudes and emotions, and in this area our self-understanding is very poor indeed, and we do make a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of errors here. It also uses retrospective reports, people reporting on their past behaviour, how stimuli have affected them, sort of dominant paradigm in psychology. And Erickson and Simon said, if you investigate people's concurrent reports as they carry out actions, they're much more accurate. And I just took this another step, saying if you use prospective predictions, if you get people to generate an intention, So if I asked Jeff to generate intention for what he'll do tomorrow, and I asked Bob what Jeff will be doing tomorrow, and then if they both are offered $500 if they get it right, Jeff is more, because he generates the intention, is more likely to be aware of that intention, even than an informed observer like Bob. Interesting example of this, if it's not clear, with the recent American election where there were polls on whether people would vote for Obama or McCain, and 48% of the American population said they'd vote for Obama. And this, of course, includes the unemployed, the cleaners, a lot of uneducated people in America, as well as, of course, the most educated people. And all the experts, and a lot of social psychologists, my own area broadly, with their PhDs and so on, said, well, no, this isn't going to happen. That when these people get in the polling booth, some experts said, 8% will change their mind. Their racism will become salient. They won't be able to, when it comes to the crunch, they won't be able to vote for Obama. Some said it would be 42%, some said 43, 40. Well, the cleaners and all the maids in hotels and so on, they actually did what they thought they were going to do. They voted for Obama. It was only 1% off what the polls said, and the experts were actually wrong. But it's a case where actors, even the most humble human, generates intentions, and they may or may not carry out those intentions, but they know better than an observer. This doesn't extend to our motives. If we give our motives for why we've done an action, as you know, we often lie or pretend or say we've done things for more honourable reasons than we have. So our special access is circumscribed to a certain class of cognitions. You must read my book to get a longer story. For each one I sell, I get enough money to buy a Big Mac. So, okay, it's not a genuine plug for the book. This last argument, I'm going to look at it in a little bit more detail. I've been fascinated with this argument over the last 2 years. Dan Wegner at Harvard, a very bright guy. Been writing on it since '99. Here's a photo from his homepage. And so he's shifting from unconscious processes that Nisbet and Wilson and John Barge looked at to conscious processes, specifically the feeling of free will. And he said, well, who controls these conscious processes? Do we have a homunculus that's a little person inside our brain, a self, another person inside the self? Is there an infinite regress of persons inside the brain? How do we explain this? He says, no, there isn't. And in 2008, he likes to draw in Dennett's metaphor of breaking a spell. Dennett's recent book argues that religion is a spell, and he's trying to break this spell. And Wegner says he's trying to do the same with our belief that we have free will is a kind of spell, and it's wrong. So what's his argument? He says free will, our feeling, it's based on causal inferences about what we've done. It's not based on access to this special kind of causation. He gives the analogy with magicians. What a magician does is to conceal the real cause of what he or she is doing and creates an illusory sequence of events. So Wegner says the self-perception of free will is no more evidence for free will than our impression that a rabbit comes out of a hat. And the model he uses is from Michaud, 1963, I think from Belgium, who examined what's going on when we infer physical causation. You might think of two billiard balls. Or, glasses in this case. Does the microphone work when I'm standing here?
not for the population.
Okay, I'll stay here. So, Michaud said that there's three parameters to this. Priority, firstly, if a cause precedes the event, so if this glass moves this way and then that one moves, we'll see this first one as a cause, right? Because it's prior. If this one moves first and that one doesn't, then we won't see it as a cause. Secondly, consistency. If the cause is compatible with the event, so if this glass moves this way, and this is hidden, the point of contact, but then if you see this glass moving that way, you won't see this one as the cause because it's not consistent with the event. But if you see this one moving this way and this one moves the same way, we'll see it as the cause. And exclusivity, which I can't quite illustrate with two glasses and not being an octopus, but is that if the cause is the only cause, we'll infer it's the cause. So if there's two glasses converging on another glass, or two billiard balls converging on another, and they both hit it, then we won't infer that one of them is a cause, because we don't know which one is the cause. And he applies this to our mental thinking, and he says our perception of free will follows the same principles. So if we intend to hit a person and then do so, we infer that our intention is the cause of the event. An example of this is if you think, I wish that person would drop dead, and then if they do drop dead, and you haven't caused it, some people shoot people and they have caused it, but you feel guilty. So that's an example of this inference. It's illogical, but because it's prior to the event and consistent with the event, we infer we caused the event. Exclusivity applied to free will. We discount our will where there are other causes. And interesting exotic examples like hypnosis, where we say if a person under hypnosis does something not because they wanted to, but because the hypnotist made them do it. Or the obedience excuse. There are experiments in psychology showing this. You may know the Milgram experiments. But people are perhaps more familiar with examples in war where people have done something and said, well, the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis and other trials, people said, well, I just did it because I was obeying commands. I wasn't responsible for the action. Now, Wegener said we can manipulate these and give people a sense of free will even if the action isn't willed. So, for example, I'll just give you an example of one experiment where he put Fred's in front in a kind of a smock, and Fred's facing a mirror. Perhaps put it, I'll show it kind of side on, but he's got to keep his hands at his side, and then Peter's behind him, and Peter puts his hands through the smock, and Fred's told to keep his hands at his side, and then they get instructions. In one condition, only Peter behind gets the instructions over earphones. And in the second condition, they both get the same instructions. And so the instructions might be, click your fingers, and so Peter behind will click his fingers, and Fred, looking in the mirror, it looks like his arm, clicking the fingers. So, and where they both can hear the instructions, Peter feels he controls the actions to some extent, although the actions are Peter's. But in fact, in this study, the shift in the control ratings is quite small. On a 7-point scale, it's statistically significant, but it's only from 2.46 to 3. So it's not really, as Namias has pointed out, not really a threat to free will. A little bit of an illusion of control on Fred's. It's like a visual illusion. And of course, Fred could disobey. It'd be interesting if Fred, instead of keeping his arms at his side, which he had to do in this experiment to get course credits at the University of Virginia, if he'd decided to, if he got instructions from different earphones to do something different, the whole experiment would break down. There's other issues with this model. Priority, Frith has pointed out that unlike physical causes where we infer causation, usually for causes that occur just immediately before a second event happens, Intentions can exist long before. You know, many of us planned to come to this conference long before the event happened. And this seems to be different from physical causes. There's also differences or problems with consistency. You know, our intentions often lead to unintended consequences. You know, we intend to compliment someone but insult them, or vice versa. And sometimes other causes may fulfill our intentions. You know, we may think, I've got to work to get enough money to go to something on this holiday, but then Grandma gives us $100 so we don't need to work. But that doesn't threaten our sense of free will. But it's a challenge. It shows that even there doesn't need to be consistency to experience free will. And finally, exclusivity. This idea, it implies that, and this is really my area, this implies that actions have single causes and that all causes are negatively related to each other, that you have, one cause or another. There are alternatives. But actions, as with many physical events, but actions reflect multiple causes. For example, you know, we may have a desire to do something, but you know, you may want to visit your grandma in Melbourne, but she may put pressure, you know, she may encourage you to come or give you the money to come, but that doesn't undermine your sense of free will. And I've studied this in relation to goals and preconditions, and Ledo and Abelson at Yale first demonstrated this. So in short, we feel free will even when there are other causes. So it seems this Michotte model doesn't apply well to free will. I think Wigner is wrong with that. Others people, in broader terms, people have said, you know, if we do make errors about free will, does this prove it's illusory? You know, we make lots of visual perceptions, and they're fun to play with, Gestalt perceptions and so on. Lots of illusions, but we don't think perception is therefore basically unreliable. They're systematic illusions. In terms of Dan Wegner's analogy with the magician at the beginning, my reply would be, well, it's like we can be fooled, like we are like audiences that are fooled by magicians, and that's what's such fun about magicians. But we're also like magicians. We fool other people and mislead others, either in incidental ways or brilliant developed deceptions like those that occur in war, like where the Allies would land at D-Day. There's a huge kind of deception about where this would occur, and similarly Hitler deceived Stalin about his intentions, so very interesting cases. So we're much more active agents than just this analogy with us being fooled by magicians. We are also magicians. And finally, on this point, or this argument, Wegner says that free will requires some homunculus or some non-scientific explanations, but this is not really true. The concept of free will itself is problematic or tricky, but intentions, which have many of the qualities of free will, they can be measured and operationalized and defined. And there's 3 theories in psychology that do that very well. And maybe we can define free will as well in similar ways. And there are alternatives in perception in terms of a perceptual attributional model of free will in psychology. But what these must include is not just these post hoc perceptions that Wegner's talking about after events have happened, but when we carry out a willed action, we also, and something that is part of the equation is what's called proprioceptive sensation. We activate our muscles and we feel our moving muscles, and this is perhaps much more important in our sensation of being able to affect the world than just observing physical events. And finally, in neuroscience, it demonstrated that intentions actually seem to use different brain processes to physical events, and maybe this had some evolutionary purpose where they've shown with monkeys and humans that some brain cells respond instantly to an animal movement and maybe this had some adaptive value for people responding to malign intentions, like some other animal wanting to eat them. So I don't think Wegener's attempt to eradicate free will is successful. Just on the evidence I mentioned, on the point earlier I mentioned where there seems to be lack of evidence, and going back to neuroscience, for a separate soul kind of stuff. Hard to find the soul in the brain as a separate kind of zone or area. Jeeves, who's a neuroscientist in Scotland, but also of a Christian persuasion, says there's no conflict with the biblical view here. The Hebrew and Greek words translated as soul in the authorized version, which I won't pronounce except for psyche, these refer to the whole person, and even to animals, and in one case a dead person or dead animal. The idea of a separate soul seems to come more from Greek philosophy, and my son with his brain injuries could tell you much more about that than I can. That's his area. So in conclusion, people may misunderstand themselves, but research does not disprove intentionality or free will, I'm arguing. So is there a ghost in the machine? Maybe it isn't just a machine. Maybe it's a person who makes decisions and is responsible, but unlike the humanists, we're not inherently good. And we are influenced by unconscious factors in the environment. And maybe we're all of a piece, but there is definitely this inside aspect of consciousness and an outside aspect where we see ourselves from the outside. So I'm going to finish with 3 quotations. We've had a magnificent presentation from Cambridge and some good quotes, but we must talk about the other place. So firstly, a professor of physics from Oxford, John Houghton, former professor of physics. Our choices are constrained by space and time, environmental circumstances, upbringing and past experiences. But not entirely so. Our freedom to choose is real. In particular, we're constantly faced with choices between good and evil, and we're only too well aware of the propensity to choose the evil rather than the good. I like it when a professor of physics can say something so insightful about our psychology. But we'd like to have John Polkinghorne from Cambridge, who is a wonderful fountain of knowledge and wisdom. He points out if the reductionists are right, those who say, we're nothing more than the physics or the sum of the parts, as Stephen was talking about, if the reductionists are right, then their own assertions are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. Anyone, Dawkins, us, Polkinghorne, if we're right, if reductionist is right, it's just blips. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the observed chattering of firing synapses. That cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. Actually, some of us do believe it to be so, but some people live with contradictions. And at Oxford, Cambridge, why not Bethlehem? A man called Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And I think that's a great statement about religion. It's a great statement about free will. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Thank you. Yeah, oh, sorry, your chair.
Oh, mine. Your talk on free will was very interesting, thank you. Just a quick question. What about people who it appears they do not have free will? As I've heard an example of someone with extensive brain damage who is in a vegetative state. They're still alive and they still are a human being, but they do not have free will.
Yeah, that's good. Good question. Thank you very much. And I had 2 reasons for giving this illustration of my son with severe brain injury, and one of those was to make it clear that I'm very aware of how much what's happening in our brain does shape what we can do and what we can't do and who we are. I guess some people may have more free will than others, partly for what is degrees of brain damage, but also the constraints maybe that other people place on them. Does a person living in total poverty who has nothing, they can live a fantastic life, but maybe they can't do what some people can do. They can make very limited choices. So the environment can sometimes circumscribe what we can do. If you have nothing and you're starving and you're in the desert, then what can you do? And so maybe that's another condition. So I would agree that someone with severe brain damage, and my son has severe brain injury, not as serious as what you're talking about. If it happened in New Zealand, it would be, because at that time we didn't have that kind of surgery. So yes, a person then is, you never quite know what's actually happening. I don't like the word vegetative state with humans. I saw people in a vegetative state. 8 people in the unit with my son Joe, all of them temporarily at least in a vegetative state or something like it. And some of them 3 weeks later running round or doing very strange things. And sometimes they find with current research that there's more going on than we think. So I don't like using that terminology to describe what seems to us to be in a coma is fine. So yep. There's Alistair McGrath's wife, Joanna Caldecott-McGrath, has written on exactly that issue in a book. I've got a chapter, I can give you a copy if you give me your name. I've got a pre-press chapter, I've got it actually right there. Hoping I'd glance at it again before the talk. Dealing with this issue with degrees of brain damage and injury, just how this affects personhood, and she does it far more brilliantly than I could do. She's a clinical psychologist. So yeah, long answer and not a very conclusive one, but I hope that's informative. I'd like to give you the chapter if you're interested.
Thank you.
Could I follow up on that, please?
Sure.
You asked those people who were in the unit with your son, you asked them after they've regained more or less normal operation, did they feel they had free will during that time when they couldn't communicate? I know of a case, the prominent neurosurgeon Anthony James, FRACS, who suffered the most devastating stroke, no motion, no grunting, nothing. And his son, Americo, and I used to go and visit him and just converse in front of him. He couldn't respond at all. We couldn't tell whether he had any free will or anything, but we would talk about the plasticity of the brain, which he knew a lot about, having operated on many brains. And he lived to walk and talk again at the end of that summer, and he told us, sure enough, that he had thoughts and had willed mental states during that period of what some people would call vegetative existence. So ask them afterwards, those that recover,
Yes.
and you'll find they can think. They can't do anything about it.
Right.
They can think. And I can imagine a cube now, and that is a surer fact than anything from science or from any of the people you mentioned, or from Benjamin Libet or anyone. I can imagine a cube now. My choice of mental states is a surer fact than anything from outside of me. Isn't that so?
Yeah, sorry, I must just give one more anecdote on this issue, but when my son was in this severe head injury unit of these 8 beds, someone from the church came in, a young enthusiastic group, and they wanted to sing songs to Joe to help heal him and bring him out of he was actually under an induced coma at the time, but they thought it'd be helpful to sing him Kia Kaha, which is a Maori song. So they sang this loudly in the unit, and we sort of thought, And they were told to be quiet because actually the man in the next bed was writhing. But it did get him out of his coma, but he was writhing. he was on all these experimental drugs from France and so on, but the doctors thought it wasn't a good approach. But anyway, sort of another interesting point.
Of course, many theologians will argue that we don't have free will.
Yes, yeah, there's the spectrum within theology from the Calvinist to just the point that many theologians don't believe in free will. Yes, we do have a spectrum within Christianity and maybe in other religions from a Armenian viewpoint. Is that what it's called, to a Calvinist viewpoint? Yeah.
Okay, one last question down the back.
Well, John, just a brief remark on the question. It's quite interesting how the discussion about free will seems to track with current economic forces. I once met an academic in Cambridge who was quite insistent that discussion of free will in Oxford increased since Margaret Thatcher gained power in 1979. And sort of corollary to that is that I can put to anyone a whole bunch of chocolate fish that with the current economic meltdown and the failure of unconstrained free market economics, that will probably get more talk about social responsibility and less of free will.
No, I'm just a psychologist, so yeah, sounds interesting. Did the miners have more free will? Yeah.
Sylvia, one last question. Do you have a question?
It's not even a proper question, but I'm just thinking about how we pray as Christians for God to guide us. And how much do we really listen? Or I haven't formulated it, but I'm just trying to think, how much does our own will tell us what we think He's telling us? And how much are we really open to be guided? And that's a bit of a muddy statement to make.
Yeah, I think that's.
Because sometimes people say, God told me to do this or that.
All right.
And somebody else says, oh no, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I think everyone here would have as good an answer to that as I would, I think. As a psychologist, I can't really reply to it, if you don't mind. So yeah, I can make a suggestion, but I'd want to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think it's, thank you.